today, and it's already passed because of the time difference, but today, Pope Leo asked everyone in the world to join him in a vigil for peace. And I try hard not to ignore the Pope, and so we're going to need to talk today about peace. And we're going to talk about war, and we're going to talk about Iran. And I can already see you're tensing up, and it's okay, we're going to get through this together. But it's on everybody's mind, it's on the Pope's mind, and we should make sure we can figure out where the church is and where Jesus is in all of this. So first, I want to make a helpful distinction that comes to me from a book called After Virtue by Alistair MacIntyre, between virtue and law. He says that a society, a city, is kept together by these two things, virtue and law. Virtue is what the entire society is aiming for. This is our shared and common goal. This is the height that we are trying to achieve together. A city is not kept together well by anything other than a shared vision. However, a city or a society or a country or a world also needs laws. A law is the minimum standard. So you think about a city or a law or a country or whatever else. You have the minimum standard. You break this standard, and there are consequences. Sometimes it's a fee or a fine or it's prison time, or sometimes it's exile. But there are consequences. So there's the minimum standard to live in the city, but then minimum standards don't keep us well together. There's the virtue. This is what we're always aiming toward. Unfortunately, in the United States and many other societies today, we only think in terms of law. We say, okay, as long as you're not breaking any laws, you're fine. But we've lost that shared vision, the thing that unites us together. So, when we think about the Pope, when we think about the very, very strong messages of peace he's been preaching, basically since he was elected, but especially in the last couple months, we should think about he's laying out for us the virtue, the common vision, the thing that we want. Regardless of our politics, regardless of any specific conflict, every Christian should be able to say with the Pope, we want peace. We should be able to say that peace is always our goal, that we are constantly working together for peace. And in fact, you might even go further and say that the common vision of Christians is that first reading, where they had everything in common and they were praying together and they were eating together exuberantly. That's wonderful, right? We should say that's what we want. That's what society should look like. That's where we want to get. Now, I always point out to people who like this reading, like a chapter or two later, we've got this story of two Christians who pretended to sell everything they had and give it to the apostles, but they lied to Peter. And they tell Peter at different times they're both struck dead at his feet. So the Christian community wasn't perfect, and it wasn't perfect from the very beginning. But Luke, in the Acts of the Apostles, chapter 2, right after the ascension, Luke is showing us the goal. This is the virtue. This is the common vision that should unite us. This is the thing that we should all want. So when it comes to war and peace and international conflict and violence, we should at least have a common vision. We want peace. We want a world without violence. We want a world in which none of this is necessary. We want a world in which all people can sit down together and break bread together, where they can love each other, where their resources are used to support each other. That's what we want. That should not be controversial. And when we think about the role that the Pope plays, not just Pope Leo, but basically every Pope in the 20th century, the popes have set themselves up to be prophets of peace. It doesn't really matter what the conflict is. It doesn't really matter where the war is or what countries are involved. The Pope is always out front in the world calling for peace. He's always saying, we do not want war. We should pray for an end to war. We should pray for a world in which we do not have war. And again, that should not be controversial. We should be able to pray with Pope Leo today or a couple hours ago in Rome. We should be able to pray with him that all war would cease, that vision can be achieved. Now, I will also say, one of my great motivations of evangelization is practical and temporal. My greatest motivation for evangelization, for preaching the gospel and bringing people to Jesus, is the salvation of their souls, what St. Peter talks about in our second reading. Salvation comes through Jesus Christ. The more people who know Jesus, the more guaranteed we are that the world will be saved. But there's also a temporal motivation. I believe that salvation does not just begin after you die, but it begins here. The more people who give their lives to Jesus, the Prince of Peace, the more people who love the Lord Jesus, the less there will be conflict in the world in general. Now again, Acts of the Apostles shows us the church is full of human beings, and we constantly have conflict. And we've seen that in the history of the church. Catholic Church is not without conflicts. But the great vision is that if we all just loved Jesus more, those conflicts would diminish. A lot of times when we look at the history of the Catholic Church and see its division, its fight, its own violence, we don't say, well, everything was fine. We usually say, well, maybe we weren't loving Jesus enough. And we go back to that vision. If we just loved Jesus more, things would be better. And I believe that. I believe that about war, and I believe that about peace. The more people who love Jesus, the less there will be war. The more people who love Jesus, the less there will be conflict. The more we love Jesus in our own lives, the less we will be agents of violence or conflict in our families, in our communities, in our churches, in our world. The more we love Jesus, the better things get. That's our common vision. Now, this is where things get complicated. Now we get to the law part. The vision should not be controversial. We should all be able to say, with the Pope and everybody else in the Christian world, and hopefully everybody else in the world, we don't want war. But then the law part, what's the minimum standard? We know that humans are sinful. We are a disaster. We're a mess as a species. That's why we needed the cross. That's why we needed Jesus. And sometimes there is this idea that there have to be defenders. So, when is war allowable? When are we allowed to use weapons? Two standards from Catholic moral theology. Number one, the ends can never justify the means. Which is to say, if it's always and everywhere wrong to do something, we don't really care what your motivation was. If it's always and everywhere wrong to do it, you're not allowed to do it, no matter what your motivation was. If it's always wrong to kill an innocent person, I don't care if killing that person is going to cure cancer. You cannot kill the innocent person because that's always and everywhere wrong. Core bedrock teaching of Catholic theology. Second, when we have a hierarchy of goods, when we have a bunch of principles arrayed next to each other, when we're trying to make decisions between things, the highest value in this type of Catholic moral theology, you could talk about martyrs and other things, but the highest value when you're making kind of a scholastic moral decision is the protection of innocent life. When you have two things in conflict, and the Church has resolved which of these two things you're allowed to do when they're in conflict, in every case, the Church has always come down on the side of innocent life. Always. In every case. You must protect innocent life. So when we're asking questions about weapons, or war, or conflict, or violence, the first question the Church asks is, where does innocent life fall into this? And the question we're answering with something called just war that we're going to talk about in a second is this in defense of innocent life? And the reason we do that is because when we're talking about violence, and especially when we're talking about war, we're talking about ending life, which is a terrible thing. Again, why our common vision is we want a world without war. Ending life is a terrible thing because we all only have one life, and every human life is unique. We should never, ever end life. However, from very ancient times, we've had a doctrine of self-defense. If somebody is coming to kill you, you are allowed to defend yourself. That might cause the ending of a life, which is a tragedy in every case. But it's morally justified if it's in defense of innocent life. And so when we talk about anything that ends life, be it personal self-defense, be it societal self-defense, or be it war, the only thing that can justify taking a life is the defense of innocent life. That's the only thing that can possibly balance. And it's life for life. And even then, the Church always says you have to expire every other possible solution. If you're trying to defend your home, It is better to find a way to defend yourself without killing somebody than to kill somebody. Which is not to say it's not morally justifiable. There are ways in which self-defense that ends a life is justified, but we're always looking for any other way out of that. Now, the personal self-defense thing is the best way to understand the Church's doctrine of just war. Just war is the question of when is it morally justifiable to go to war? When is it morally justifiable to have a societal ending of life rather than like a personal self-defense ending of life? And in every case, just war theory looks like self-defense. It always has to be in defense of innocent life. There have to be innocent lives that you're trying to protect. Now, just war theory was developed in what we might call a simpler time. So the analogies begin simple and get complicated. When you have two countries right next to each other, equally matched, and one country decides it just really likes your mountain, it's a really pretty mountain and we want it, and they attack you, okay, that's a very easy situation. You are allowed to defend yourself because that neighboring country is attacking you, go for it. Now, there are like 7 principles of use ad bellum, the principles you're supposed to respect on your way to war, and then there are 2 principles use in bellum. We're not going to go through each of those lists. Maybe I'll offer some adult education later where we go through that. But in general, we have to be thinking the only thing that can possibly justify war or violence is the protection of innocent life. Here is where things get very complicated with the current situation. There is something called asymmetric warfare. Iran, for example, did not roll tanks into Iraq. It has in the past, it didn't this time. Iran didn't seem to have had any imminent threat. It wasn't like, my finger's on the button unless you do what I say, right? But things are complicated because Iran has funded state-sponsored terrorism in Lebanon and in Gaza and in other places in the Middle East. At what point is it a declaration of war? Things get very complicated there. Catholic just war theory has struggled to keep up with an era of terrorism. Has Iran declared war on another country? By its government and officially, no. This side of the Cold War, where the United States fought proxy wars and Russia fought proxy wars, and now Iran is fighting proxy wars, just war theory begins to get very difficult. Similarly, you have the question of autocrats. If the Iranian leader is killing his own people in the streets for protesting in favor of democracy, at what point is a foreign power allowed to defend those innocent lives? Again, far more complicated. Just war theory figures out war between governments, and we have some very clear teachings on that. I have to tell you, the situation in Iran, harder, and I'm not going to resolve that political question for you. You're going to have to read the catechism. There's a section on war. Please read it. You're going to have to pray about the principles outlined in the catechism, and you're going to have to decide what you think about the current political situation. But I will tell you, if you have any motivation for the United States actions that is other than innocent life, that's what's putting you outside of the Church's teachings. It can only be for the defense of innocent life. That is the only thing that can possibly justify violence. It's the only thing that can possibly justify the taking of life. We have to have first and foremost in our mind the defense of somebody. It's the only thing that can justify it. I would ask with the Pope today that we renew our prayers for peace. Whether we think any individual conflict is justified or not, we should always pray that that conflict ends. We should always pray that there is another means to protect people, that there is another way in which we can bring safety and security to the world and to people. We have to be praying for that regularly, constantly. We have to constantly be looking for any way in which we are not agents of violence in the world, but we're agents of peace. We have to have that shared vision. I'm thankful for the Pope. I'm thankful for him being a prophet of peace. I'm thankful for his call that we would pray for an end to violence. I would ask you please to join me on this Divine Mercy Sunday in offering ourselves to the mercy of God and asking for his help in ending violence in our community, in our country, and in our world.